In medieval England, capturing a Viking queen didn't end a war. It escalated it. These women were not treated as prisoners. They were turned into tools. Stripped in public. Shaved. Sold into forced marriages. And in some cases, mutilated slowly, on purpose. This is the story of what the Saxons did to captured Viking queens, and how one mother's suffering unleashed a revenge that reshaped England forever. In the fall of 867 AD, I want you to picture a Viking queen being hauled through the filthy, rain-soaked streets of Nottingham. Her name is Elfwin. Just 3 weeks earlier, she was in command of a massive force, 40 longships under her authority. Now she's being dragged by Saxon soldiers, her clothes torn off her body, while crowds of townspeople line the streets, hurling rotten food and human waste straight into her face. And believe it or not, that isn't even the worst of it. What the Anglo-Saxons did to captured Viking queens went far beyond anything most of us ever learned in school. By the time this story is over, you'll understand why modern historians spent more than 100 years quietly trying to keep this buried. I'm going to walk you through 3 revelations that will completely change how you see medieval England. First, you'll learn how royal women were exploited as political tools in ways that are almost impossible to imagine today, methods so savage they make Game of Thrones feel like a kid's show. Second, I'll explain how the fate of one queen ignited a revenge campaign that stretched across generations and left thousands dead. And third, I'll show you the archaeological evidence, real, physical proof, that exposes torture practices historians deliberately kept out of public view. And if you're interested in the kind of hidden history textbooks never touch, now's the time to subscribe, because we're about to step into the darkest corner of the Viking Age. But to understand what happened to these women, you first need to understand what was happening in England between 865 and 878 AD. This was the age of the Great Heathen Army, the largest Viking invasion force ever assembled. And here's the part your history teacher probably skipped. Viking shield maidens were not legends. They actually existed. Excavations conducted in 2017 at Birka, in Sweden, confirmed that elite Viking women were buried with full military honors, surrounded by swords, axes, and battlefield gear. DNA testing proved these weren't symbolic graves or ceremonial gestures. These women were real warriors. Royal women in Norse society didn't just stay behind in longhouses waiting for news. They led raids. They commanded fleets. And when their husbands died, they ruled entire kingdoms. Women like Lagetha, whose campaigns were recorded by the historian Saxo Grammaticus. Or Freydis Eirikstotia, who reportedly killed 5 women with an axe during the Vinland expeditions. So when the Great Heathen Army landed in England, it wasn't just male warriors stepping off those longships. Royal women arrived too, as leaders, strategists, and fighters. And on the rare occasions when Anglo-Saxon forces managed to capture one of these women, they were confronted with a terrifying dilemma. What do you do with an enemy queen who has personally killed your men? The answer was brutal. Medieval justice slammed headfirst into territorial warfare, creating a cycle of violence that would permanently reshape England. But here's the part the textbooks conveniently leave out. The Saxons didn't treat these women like prisoners of war. They treated them like weapons. And the first weapon they used wasn't death, it was humiliation. What I'm about to describe isn't guesswork. It's documented across multiple historical sources, including the Anglo-Saxon Chronicle, though the monks who recorded it used intentionally vague language. Archaeology, however, has filled in the gaps they hoped no one would notice. Imagine being a Viking noblewoman. In your culture, your hair isn't just hair, it's sacred. You've grown it since childhood, carefully braiding it with silver rings that showcase your family's wealth and status. Your clothes are woven with rare dyes, deep reds and rich blues, colors that announce who you are the moment you walk into a room. None of this is about vanity. This is your identity. Now imagine Saxon soldiers forcing you to the ground while they scrape your head with a dull blade. This was the opening phase of what I call the humiliation protocol. When high-ranking Viking women were captured, the Saxons began with a stripping ritual that was deliberately public. Not hidden. Not quick. Right in the center of town, surrounded by crowds who had lost family members to Viking raids. The Anglo-Saxon Chronicle mentions these events, but only in frustratingly vague terms. It says the heathen women were brought forth and made to face Christian justice. But here's what that phrase really meant. First, the women were stripped completely naked. In Norse culture, where modesty and honor were inseparable, that alone was catastrophic. But the Saxons weren't finished. They shaved the women's heads until they were completely bald. Every piece of jewelry was taken, melted down, and handed over to the church. And here's the part nobody ever tells you. This wasn't just about humiliation. What was happening here was spiritual warfare. The Vikings believed that a person's luck, their hemminger, was something real, something that could be damaged or even shattered through physical acts. By stripping away the outward signs of rank and identity, the Saxons believed they were neutralizing these women's ability to curse them or bring misfortune. And recent archaeology backs up just how seriously they took this belief. At Repton, one of the Great Heathen Army's primary winter camps, archaeologists uncovered something deeply unsettling. A mass grave holding 264 bodies, including at least 20 women. Several of those women showed clear signs of perimortem trauma to the skull, injuries inflicted at or very near the moment of death. But what truly disturbed researchers wasn't just how they died. It was how they were buried. These women were placed face down in the earth. In Viking belief, that position isn't merely insulting, it's a deliberate curse. It was meant to prevent the spirit from ever reaching the afterlife. The Saxons weren't simply killing these women. They were trying to erase them, body and soul. One figure keeps appearing in 4 separate Saxon chronicles from this era. She's referred to only as the Heathen Queen. And every single time her name appears, it has been violently scratched out of the manuscript. Someone, long ago, decided that recording her true identity was too dangerous. But this was only the beginning. What the Saxons did next violated every known medieval rule of warfare, every Christian teaching of mercy, and every basic standard of human decency. And somehow, it gets even worse. You might assume that, at some point, these women were released. After all, prisoner exchanges were common in medieval conflicts. That would make sense. But that's not what happened. Instead, the Saxons created something far more intentional, and far more cruel. They turned captured royal women into commodities. In 871 AD, a Viking queen named Sigrid was taken during the Battle of Wilton. She was the widow of a Norse jarl and the mother of 3 sons who were still actively fighting with the Great Heathen Army. By medieval standards, she was a high-value hostage. The logical move would have been to demand a ransom. The Saxons chose a different path. They sold her, quietly. The Anglo-Saxon Chronicle refers to it as a Christian marriage, personally arranged by King Alfred. But Asser's Life of King Alfred, written by a monk who actually knew the king, paints a far darker picture. Sigrid was forced into marriage with a Saxon nobleman named Alderman Ethelwulf. She was baptized against her will, stripped of her faith, given a Christian name, and confined to an estate in Wessex. Her children were taken as leverage. Her youngest son, barely 8 years old, was placed in a monastery, where he would be raised Christian and taught to despise his own ancestry. This wasn't an exception. This was policy. DNA analysis of burial sites around Oxford has revealed something remarkable. Multiple graves dating to the late 800s contain women with Scandinavian genetic markers, buried according to Christian rites, laid beside Saxon noblemen, and adorned with Saxon jewelry. These women weren't raiders. They were prisoners. They were hostages. They were forced brides. The Anglo-Saxons had created what I call a hostage economy. Viking queens and noblewomen became bargaining chips. A Saxon lord looking to expand his influence could marry a captured Norse woman, absorb her family's wealth, and use her children as leverage against Viking forces still in the field. But this is where the story turns truly dark. These women weren't just captives. They were part of a breeding strategy. The Saxons believed that forcing these women to bear Christian children would dilute Viking bloodlines and eventually erase Norse culture altogether. One account from the monastery at Lindisfarne describes a Viking woman who refused food for 11 days after her forced marriage. The monks recorded that she was force-fed until she became pregnant because, in their words, a heathen womb that bears a Christian child is sanctified by suffering. Think about that. They genuinely believed forced pregnancy was a path to salvation. Most of these women never returned home. They died on foreign estates, surrounded by people who despised them, raising children taught to be ashamed of their mother's blood. But one woman refused to be broken. Her name was Ingrid Ragnarsdottir. She was a queen. She was a warrior. And she was the mother of a son who would become one of the most feared Viking leaders in history. When the Saxons captured her in 869 AD, they made the same assumption they'd made with dozens of women before. They believed she would eventually submit. She didn't. And what she did next would soak England in blood for the next 50 years. Don't go anywhere yet, because what happened to Queen Ingrid is the most disturbing chapter of this entire story. And the archaeological proof that confirms it wasn't uncovered until 2019. Queen Ingrid was imprisoned in Nottingham for nearly 2 years. During that time, fragmentary records from several sources paint a clear picture of her resistance. She refused to convert to Christianity. She refused to give up any knowledge of Viking strategy or troop movements. She refused to eat food prepared by Saxon hands. And above all else, she refused to marry. The Saxons tried every method they knew. They starved her. They isolated her. They beat her publicly. None of it broke her. So eventually, they abandoned temporary punishments and moved toward something permanent. In medieval warfare, there was a practice known as hobbling. The name is literal. The tendons behind a person's ankles are cut so they can never walk normally again. The victim is crippled for life, unable to run, unable to fight, unable to escape. The Saxons did this to Queen Ingrid. But they didn't stop there. According to Norse sagas preserved in Iceland, sources historians long dismissed as exaggerated, they also blinded her in one eye. This wasn't random cruelty. It was symbolic. In Norse belief, Odin sacrificed one of his eyes in exchange for wisdom. By taking a queen's eye, the Saxons weren't just maiming her. They were mocking her gods. For generations, historians treated these saga accounts as propaganda, stories Viking descendants told to justify their own brutality. But in 2019, that dismissal collapsed. Forensic archaeologists examining remains from a churchyard in Nottingham made a discovery that stunned the academic world. They uncovered the skeleton of a woman carbon dated to between 865 and 875 AD. Genetic testing showed clear Scandinavian ancestry. She was between 35 and 40 years old when she died, and her bones told a terrifying story. Both Achilles tendons showed unmistakable evidence of intentional severing. The healing patterns revealed she survived the injury for at least 18 months. Her left eye socket showed trauma consistent with deliberate blinding. Her right forearm had been broken and healed improperly, likely the result of repeated defensive injuries that were never treated. This wasn't damage from battle. This was torture. Deliberate. Repeated. Prolonged. But the detail that made international headlines was her teeth. Dental analysis revealed thin gold wire threaded through her teeth, a practice exclusive to Norse royalty. The gold had been violently ripped out, leaving visible damage to both enamel and jawbone. The Saxons had quite literally tried to strip her identity from her mouth. The lead archaeologist, Dr. Helena Morrison, wrote in her published findings that the injury patterns indicate systematic mutilation carried out over an extended period. The intent, she concluded, was not execution, but permanent disfigurement combined with prolonged suffering. Queen Ingrid died in 871 AD. She died imprisoned. And she died unbroken. The Anglo-Saxon Chronicle records her death in a single dismissive sentence: the heathen woman perished in the winter. But the Saxons made one fatal miscalculation. Her son survived. And he remembered everything. I know how dark this story has become, but if you're still listening, then you're clearly as drawn to history's brutal truths as I am. Make sure you're subscribed, because next week I'll be breaking down what really happened during the Viking blood eagle ritual, and the archaeological evidence showing it was even worse than legend claims. Now let me tell you about the revenge that reshaped England forever. Queen Ingrid's son was Ivar Ragnarsson, known to history as Ivar the Boneless. When news of his mother's death reached him in 871 AD, he made a vow recorded across multiple Norse sagas. Every Saxon noble involved in her torture would be found. And they would suffer exactly as she had. He kept that promise. Between 871 and 878 AD, Ivar launched what historians politely refer to as the Great Retribution. But that phrase sanitizes what really happened. This was organized, deliberate revenge. The Norse sagas, especially Ragnarssona with acute ttr, describe Ivar keeping meticulous records. Names. Locations. Crimes. His attacks weren't random raids. He targeted specific estates, specific bloodlines, and specific women. And the punishments matched the offenses precisely. The wife of Alderman Ethelwulf, the same man who had been forced to marry the captive Viking Queen Sigrid, was found in 873 AD. Her head had been shaved. Her body was displayed in the center of her burning estate. A Mercian abbess who had overseen the force-feeding of pregnant Viking captives met a similar fate. The saga states she was made to understand the suffering she caused, language that strongly suggests force-feeding until death. And here's the critical part. We have archaeological evidence that supports these accounts. Multiple Saxon mass graves from the 870s show consistent patterns of violence directed specifically at high-status women. Graves in Mercia, Northumbria, and East Anglia all tell the same story: noblewomen buried hastily, often together, with clear signs of violent death. This wasn't chaos. It was retribution. One grave, more than any other, tells the story clearly. Excavated near Repton in 2003, it contained the remains of 14 Saxon women, all buried together in a single pit. Forensic analysis showed that at least 8 of them had suffered mutilations that closely matched the punishments described in Norse sagas. At the time, archaeologists labeled it a tragic civilian massacre. But when those findings were compared with saga narratives and cross-checked against Saxon chronicles, a very different interpretation emerged. These women weren't random victims of war. They were targets. This was revenge, and it worked. By 878 AD, the Saxons were in crisis. The Great Heathen Army had seized control of most of northern England, and the pressure was relentless. King Alfred, who had previously supported the hostage economy, abruptly changed course. His new strategy wasn't kindness. It was survival. The Treaty of Wedmore, signed in 878, didn't just divide England into Saxon and Viking zones of control. It included very specific rules about how prisoners were to be treated. For the first time in English medieval history, a treaty explicitly stated that captured women must be treated according to their social rank, allowed to maintain their religious practices, and offered ransom instead of forced conversion. This wasn't Christian compassion. This was fear-driven pragmatism. Alfred had seen what happened when Viking queens were brutalized. He'd witnessed the retaliation. He'd watched entire Saxon noble families vanish. The creation of the Danelaw, regions governed under Viking law, was directly shaped by this cycle of cruelty and revenge. Vikings didn't just conquer land. They settled it permanently. Because returning home meant leaving their women exposed to capture, abuse, and torture. Modern genetic studies back this up. Across northern and eastern England, Scandinavian DNA markers appear far more frequently than historians once believed. These people aren't just descendants of Viking raiders. They're descendants of Viking families who chose permanent settlement over the risk of losing their women to Saxon captivity. As historian Dr. James Crawford of Cambridge put it, the brutal treatment of captured Viking noblewomen in the 860s and 870s directly led to permanent Scandinavian settlement in England. Fear of repeated torture made retreat impossible. The Saxons didn't just lose territory. They reshaped England's genetic and cultural identity through their own cruelty. And here's the final twist. Remember those Saxon noble graves containing women with Scandinavian DNA? After 878 AD, that pattern ends completely. No more forced marriages. No more hostage systems. No more breeding programs. Why? Because Alfred knew exactly what would happen if it continued. The revenge unleashed by Queen Ingrid's son didn't just redraw borders. It changed England's soul. So let's be honest about what really happened in medieval England. The abuse of captured Viking queens wasn't accidental. It wasn't isolated. It was official policy. It was systematic dehumanization, designed to crush resistance and absorb an enemy culture. And it failed. Spectacularly. Between 865 and 878 AD, cycles of torture and retaliation killed thousands, transformed England's political landscape, and created cultural divisions that lasted for centuries. The Danelaw wasn't just conquered land. It was a permanent reminder that brutality only breeds more brutality. And this matters today. Because we're watching the same pattern repeat across the modern world. Whenever leaders are humiliated, prisoners tortured, or women weaponized through abuse, conflicts don't end. They multiply. The Middle East. Eastern Europe. Central Africa. Wherever cycles of violence exist, the pattern is the same. Humiliation creates revenge. Revenge fuels retaliation. And retaliation hardens into generational hatred. The Anglo-Saxons believed they were being strategic. They thought breaking Viking queens would break Viking resistance. Instead, they forged an enemy that would never forgive, never forget, and never stop. So I'll leave you with this question. If you were Queen Ingrid's son, if you had watched your mother suffer for years in captivity, what would you have chosen? Mercy? Or revenge? Would you have ended the cycle, or become part of it? Let me know in the comments. And if you want more hidden history that textbooks quietly avoid, make sure you're subscribed with notifications turned on. Next week, I'm uncovering the truth behind the Viking blood eagle, and the archaeological evidence is even more disturbing than the legends. Thanks for watching. And remember, history isn't what they teach you in school. It's what they tried to hide.